I'm going to start at the end of a presentation. So the last thing I'm going to say to you is the first thing I'm going to say to you, and you need to remember this. The Ark was built by amateurs. The Titanic was built by professionals. Go to the hill understanding that. And everybody talks about all the tools that you have in your toolbox. You have the biggest tool that your representative will recognize, and it's called a vote. That's what you take to the hill. You also take to the end, and I always start these with about 100 slides, and then I work backwards and eliminate them. So I only have 97. But what I started to look at was the agenda. What an opportunity, what a venue. Almost 400 people here today. Yesterday at the NIH, 700 people for Rare Disease Day. For crying out loud, we were learning that together we're a roar versus individually being a whisper. And that's getting attention because it's showing growth year after year after year. Kudos to every one of you. So I'm an ex-school teacher. I'm in the restaurant business. And this is the last place I want to be. I don't want to be here. I never wanted to be here. But my wife called me up one day and said, "Hey, our daughter's sick. You better get here." So I took the experiences of building a business and I tried to figure out how can I make finding a cure a business. Forget about this nonprofit. I wanted a business. The profit was going to be a cure. How do you go about doing that? Well, you build a business. I had a menu. I needed a kitchen to cook the specific items on the menu. So I started to identify the strategic goals, the initiatives of what we wanted to do. The most important thing all of us can do, at least in my perspective, is recognize our own levels of incompetence, of which I realized I had many going into this environment. And so I had to reach out to people who could step above and teach me or take what I have started and move it forward in a direction that was much better than I could ever do alone. Sometimes it's very difficult for those of us that start a foundation to give it up, to really rely on other people, to break down the silos, because not the rarest of diseases is egoitis. And sometimes it's very difficult to eliminate that. But there's a cure for it, and the cure is you. So I'm going through all my notes, and I'm saying, I don't need my notes. All I need is the agenda that you looked at today. Item number 1, rare disease legislation in the queue. Find out what's already there that will favor your organization. Find out what is already there that might hinder it, and start there. Number 2, it says, meet and greet lunch. Networking is a phenomenal tool. Where else can you build critical mass except by talking to other people that are in the same boat that you're in? So networking, building relationships amongst the rare disease community is extremely, extremely important. Number 3, the tricks of the trade, preparing for a successful meeting. Preparation. Preparation is extremely important, and that's what you're doing here today. So you're already addressing that. You cannot go into a meeting unprepared because the reps and the senators do not have time. Don't you understand you might be the disease of the day, and tomorrow's the next disease of the day, and Thursday's the next disease of the day? And so you've got to be prepared to have an approach that's very professional, very specific and succinct that you can leave behind. I'm looking at this and it says, scenes from the Hill. You're licensed to advocate. As I said earlier, your license is your vote. You have every right to be there. You need to be there. You put them in office. They will listen to you, all of you. Very important to understand. Continue the progress long after the meeting. Ways to stay engaged. I call that persistence, dedication, intestinal fortitude, focus. Not only in Washington, D.C., but when you go back home, find out where your rep's office is. You need to talk to them. You need to thank them. You need to visit them on a regular basis. You need to invite them to lunch. You need to ask if they're up for re-election, if you would mind if you put a sign in their yard. I just think that moving forward with the congressional approach, the tools you're getting today are very, very important, but you don't have to be a registered lobbyist to move forward. You need to be a constituent, you need to be a parent, you need to be a caregiver, you need to have a cause, which you have, and you need to prepare to move forward. So I started to think that building a restaurant and designing a kitchen was complicated till I came up and I looked at 27 institutes with a $30 billion budget, and I said, let me go back to the restaurant business. Where do I start? How do I get involved? Who do I see? Who do I call? What do I do? I didn't even know the acronyms. I started my first day by making a glossary of all the initials and all the acronyms, as Annie had mentioned. And I swear, before I retire, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write a song with all the acronyms. And I think, as most of the songs we hear today, very difficult to understand, it may be a hit, and I'll donate all the money to the rare disease community. But you look at the 27 institutes, all have specific focus. For the first time, Congress mandated that they now have a strategic plan. Each institute had to come up with their own strategic plan. So there is something in place that you can look at, but you need to do what I did. I had to find out which institutes had mitochondrial disease as part of their portfolio, or a similar disease, or something in the neuromuscular department. We have identified over 250 mitochondrial diseases. So, we cross-pollinate many of these departments. Mitochondrial diseases become very ubiquitous with many of the other 7,000 rare diseases. But I thought what was interesting is not only did we have to identify what was in the portfolios, because those were the deputy directors, those were the departments we had to connect with, those are the folks that we had to build a relationship with. But then I started to look at subunits of some of the departments that we were dealing with. So this is a network of the RDCRN. This is another acronym. This is the Rare Disease, what is it? The Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. Ron Bartek always picks up what I drop. And he needs a bigger bag because I drop too much too often. But there are 22 funded consortia underneath the Rare Disease Clinical Network. And we became part of that. We build relationships with principal investigators that were making applications to get involved and to get funded within that network of the NIH, within that network of the Office of Rare Disease Research, within that network of NCATS, all under the umbrella of the RDCRN. So you get the idea of the song with all the acronyms moving forward. So we were very successful in building a relationship that allowed us to be the patient advocacy group associated with one of the funded consortia. And I'm happy to say that that consortia now consists of 16 academic sites across the country. It has now been funded for a second time. I guess the funding will be up in another year and a half to 2 years, and we'll have to reapply again. But we were very involved at the last application in working with the science officer and deputy director of the institutes that fund our consortium, identifying the very positive relationship that we have with our consortia, with our PI, letting them know how grateful we are that they are involved with us, creating a bidirectional exchange of information. Not unidirectional, but bidirectional. What we tried to do also is to build critical mass. I can remember back in the 90s going to visit, at that time, Senator Arlen Specter, who is no longer with us, but I visited Arlen Specter, and at that point in time, I was told my daughter was 1 in 200,000 people with this disease. I know now that she was 1 in 4,000. But back then, and I met with him, he sat down. Now, I knew Arlen Specter through the restaurant, the National Restaurant Foundation, and I sat down with him, and we were talking a little bit, and he introduced me to some of his aides. And he says, well, tell me about, how many people, he was a senior senator from Philadelphia, but Arlen Specter was responsible for doubling the budget of the NIH. So he was the chair of the subcommittee that appropriated for the NIH. So I sit down with him, and he says, well, how many of my constituents are you talking about? And I said, well, 1 in 200,000. And he says, you know, Jim over here is going to take care of all your needs. I've got to go. And he got up and he left. And I was dumbfounded. And then I realized that it was indeed a learning experience. And I started to build critical mass. Started to identify relationships within the rare community that identified the fact how many of us now have more similarities than we have differences. And that's what's important. Because I can tell you, I could probably name a dozen issues that cross-pollinates every person in this room without fail. So we do have to identify the similarities. Now, I think this is interesting because far too often we see that politician up on his pedestal, and this politician is telling us everything. They're telling, you need to do this, you need to do that, I'm going to do this, I'm your best friend. But then there's a person down in the wheelchair you can see next to him saying, hey, you can better engage us down here. I'm here to tell you, don't wait. Don't wait for that science officer, the deputy director. Or, you know, Dr. Francis Collins, you know, he'll call you up right away. He's the director of the NIH because he'll just, you know, he calls Julie. Julie calls you all the time, doesn't he? They don't come to you. You have to come to us. It's a bi-directional relationship, exchange of information. Get on the ground, and we need to work our way up. And this is certainly evidence that that's successful and that you've been doing that by working your way up. Don't ever forget. Now, this guy lived a long time ago. You know, Thomas Jefferson. Patriotism is not a short and frenzied burst of emotion, but the long and steady dedication of a lifetime. Tomorrow's not the end. Tomorrow's the beginning of a very, very long journey for many of you. You have to remember that this is consistency, this is dedication, this is every muscle in your body continuing to do it day after day after day. So I wanted to build critical mass, and I looked at what I called a multisystemic disease that needed a multisystemic approach. So that's why we started looking at many different approaches, and here's our good friend Arlen Specter. So this comes from our website from many years ago. So we started dealing with Arlen Specter, and I apologize because Robert Casey is now the junior, well, not a junior senator anymore, but when I was going to see Arlen Specter, Rick Santorum was the junior senator at that time, who ran for president, who is still in Washington in the think tank, doing a lot of good work, and Rick Santorum has a child with special needs. So he's very sensitive and understanding of what we're trying to do. So I started dealing with Arlen Specter when he was a Democrat, and I dealt with him again when he was a Republican, and I dealt with him again when he was a Democrat. So you've really got to keep after these. I think somebody said earlier today, if you go and knock on a door and there's a note on the door that says he's no longer here, he's at a different office, this is a perfect example. But also we post this on our website. We post this on our presentation so that people know who they should be talking to and when and where they can find them. This is another opportunity similar to what you're seeing on the website here, where we list not only an action center of congressional representatives, but also an action center of that diagram of the NIH, and we list the deputy directors and contact information and email, so that we deal with 10 of the 27 institutes that fund the 22 consortia that are relevant to our disease. So those are the 10 institutes that I want everybody to know about, at least our membership. So we also list the contact information for the representatives of those 10 institutes. So this is how you fail. So we probably learn more from our failures than our successes. We had legislation introduced in the 111th Congress. Phenomenal. We've done 4 days on the Hill. Last day on the Hill 2 years ago, we had 283 congressional visits. Our next day on the Hill will be we do international symposiums. Every other symposium coincides with a new change in Congress. So for this next Congress, 115th Congress, we're going to have another day on the Hill. And we're hoping to have even greater numbers. But, you know, this never came to fruition. We wanted an office of mitochondrial disease at the NIH. And it failed. It never got to the president's desk. But boy, what a success it was, because it enabled us to meet with people who were directed by members of Congress within the NIH structure and say, who are these guys? You better talk to them. They had 60 signatures on a bill that wasn't successful in getting passed, but yet it reverberated and resonated with many people at the NIH, resulting in us actually having a meeting with the department heads of 18 out of 27 institutes were represented, and it resulted in a white paper that we were able to discuss. And it was amazing because we went around the room, and it was a big circular room, and there were 18 deputy directors of the NIH institutes. And the one person got up and said, well, why don't we introduce ourselves and tell us why we're here? And I'll bet you at least half of those representatives of the institute said, I'm here because I want to see who else is doing research in mitochondrial disease. They didn't know, and they wanted to know. So there's a need for coordination. And it's very difficult when you're dealing with a monster battleship like the NIH. But yet we were successful by not being successful with the legislation to at least get a roundtable discussion that resulted in a white paper that now is moving forward. And here's what's ironic in my brain. I'm in the restaurant business. All right? I don't have customers come up to me and say, hey, Chuck, thanks for not giving me food poisoning. Thanks for cooking a hamburger just the way I asked you to cook it. You know, they do leave tips, but yet here we are now creating legislation, all right, resolutions to thank them for doing what we paid them to do, that it's necessary. So here's an example of a resolution that we got Senator Boxer to put forward, thanking the NIH, thanking everyone for such a phenomenal job in identifying mechanisms that need to be addressed and hopefully moving it forward. So what did it do? It was polite. We thanked everybody, but it keeps you on the radar screen. It keeps you current. It keeps you consistent with everything that's going on. So we also were successful in getting a mitochondrial disease caucus on the Hill. And so we have a Republican and a Democrat that co-chairs the caucus, and we go to their offices. We do 3 to 4 presentations a year to all the legislative representatives. And I think over the past 3 years now, we have reached and probably had well over 600 attendees come to these meetings. So we're educating the offices about mitochondrial disease. But I want you to look at, do I have a pointer? I want you to look at the topics. Nowhere up there do I want to talk about the results of oxidative phosphorylation in complex 5 of the respiratory complex chain. I don't want to talk about mitochondrial encephalopathy, lactic acidosis, and stroke-like syndrome. I want to talk about mitochondrial 101, how something so small is so important. So the people you're talking to do have a pretty strong background and understanding. They school themselves, but they're not PhDs. They're not medical. They're people that want to go home and be with their families, and they're wondering what their wife is going to cook for dinner or if their husband cut the grass, just like you. So we have to be sensible. We have to go in there and we say, hey, here's what we're trying to do. This is my understanding. Boy, there's so much to learn that I don't even know. I know one thing. I have a sick loved one, and that sick loved one needs help. And I need to know what you can help me to do. So we break it down to simple terms. You don't have to know the multi-syllable words as you move forward. That's what the NIH partners are for. They're going to take the science and move it forward. Now, through the NIH, through the Congressional Approach, we were successful in working with the Department of Defense. The congressionally peer-reviewed medical research program has a bucket of money of about $270 million, and we were successful in getting mitochondrial disease part of that disease group, and actually had 13 projects funded in excess of $11 million. So again, it wasn't because we just went to the DOD. It wasn't just because we went to Congress. It wasn't just because we went to the NIH. It was a multi-system approach. Ladies and gentlemen, destiny is not a matter of chance. It is a choice. You cannot sit there and wait for it. It is a thing to be achieved, and only you can do it. You are determined. You have a heavy weight. But by doing what you're doing today, I guarantee you, you will find other people that will pick this weight up, and you will be able to coordinate your efforts, communicate your needs, collaborate for success, and I guarantee you we'll find cures together. Thank you.